Stripling did as he was told. He arranged for the subcommittee to go to New York City, where both Hiss and Chambers worked. I imagine that another reason the face-to-face was held in New York City was that this was August and air conditioning was still fairly rare. Any excuse to get out of Washington and go north for a day. Well, Nixon's subcommittee and a few Huac staffers went up to New York and checked into the Commodore Hotel at the corner of 42nd and Lexington. It's now a Hyatt hotel. They checked into suite 1400. Now, in a stroke of luck, they'd run across Chambers in Washington and had taken him along with them. They put him in the suite's bedroom. Everybody else went into the sitting room. Chambers in the bedroom has no idea what's about to happen. The last thing he knows happened is he spilled out all the details in his secret testimony. He doesn't know the committee's begun to believe him. He doesn't know Hiss has begun to tell the George Crosley story. And what happened next is, some people say it was like a Henry James story full of subtleties and ambiguities. Hiss and Stripling said it was like a dream. It's surreal in parts, but I assure you it all happened. This was a formal hearing of Nixon's subcommittee, so there's a verbatim transcript, even though it took place in a hotel room in secret. In the interest of simplicity, I've combined all the subcommittee members into Nixon and all the staffers into Stripling. And Nixon is sitting, Stripling is standing next to him. Both are facing the door of their suite with the backs to the window. On the walls are Audubon prints of birds, and there's a sofa to one side, and they have a chair facing them. And they call Hiss on the phone and ask him to come to suite 1400 of the Commodore to meet with them and one other. And Hiss said, I figured out immediately who the other was. Hiss walked in very angry, sits in the chair facing Nixon. Hiss is about eight feet away from Nixon. And many Huac hearings, as you've gathered, sort of meandered from subject to subject. This had one single question. This had one focus. Would Hiss identify Chambers as the man he'd known as George Crosley? And Nixon says, this is starting the quotations, it's quite apparent at this stage in the testimony that this case is dependent on the question of identity. So consequently, we've asked Mr. Chambers to be in New York at the same time so that you may have the opportunity to see him and make up your own mind on that point. And Hiss says, may I interrupt at this point because I take it this will take more than 10 or 15 minutes. Would it be possible for one of the members of the committee to call the Harvard Club and leave word that I won't be there for a 6 o'clock appointment? I have to break in on the quotations at this point and say, I've never testified to a committee of Congress, but if I ever do, the first words out of my mouth will not be, do you think you could call the Harvard Club and tell them I'll be late? But Nixon says, there is a telephone, I believe, here in the room. Anytime you want to call, you may. Mr. Stripling, will you bring Mr. Chambers in? Stripling walks out and brings in Chambers. Nixon says, sit over here, Mr. Chambers. Chambers sits on the sofa to Hiss's right, but within the range of his peripheral vision, but Hiss stares straight ahead, doesn't look at Chambers. The two men are about 4 or 5 feet apart. And Nixon says, Mr. Chambers, will you please stand? And will you please stand, Mr. Hiss? And the two looked at each other. And Nixon said, Mr. Hiss, this man standing is Mr. Whittaker Chambers. I ask you now if you have ever known that man before. And Hiss says, may I ask him to speak? Will you ask him to say something? And Chambers in a low voice says, my name is Whittaker Chambers. And Hiss stands up and walks over to Chambers until he's not more than a foot away. He's about a foot taller than Chambers, and he bends over and looks at Chambers' mouth, and then he walks around Chambers and then says, would you mind opening your mouth wider? And Chambers says, my name is Whittaker Chambers. And Hiss moves his right hand about 6 inches from Chambers' mouth and does this with his thumb and index finger. He says, would you open your mouth? You know what I am referring to, Mr. Nixon. Will you go on talking? Chambers says, I am senior editor of Time magazine. And Hiss says, may I ask whether his voice when he testified before was comparable to this? And Nixon says, I would say it's about the same now as we've heard before. Hiss says, will you ask him to talk a little more? And they got a copy of Newsweek and asked Chambers to read it. And Hiss says, I think he's George Crosley, but I would like to hear him talk a little longer. Are you George Crosley? And Chambers smiles quizzically and says, not to my knowledge. You are Alger Hiss, I believe. And Hiss says, I certainly am. Then Chambers says, that was my recollection. And he starts reading. And then Nixon says, just one moment, since some repartee goes on between these two people, I think Mr. Chambers should be sworn. And Hiss says, that is a good idea. And they swear in Chambers. And then Nixon says, Mr. Hiss, I suggested that he be sworn, and when I say something like that, I want no interruptions from you. And Hiss says, Mr. Nixon, I think there's no occasion for you to use that tone of voice in speaking to me, and I hope the record will show what I have just said. And Nixon says, the record shows everything that's being said here today. And then Chambers reads a little from Newsweek, and Hiss says, the voice sounds a little less resonant than the voice that I recall of the man I knew as George Crosley. The teeth look to me as though either they've been improved upon or there's been considerable dental work done. I believe I am not prepared without further checking to take an absolute oath that he must be George Crosley. And this was a surprise because a minute ago he said, I think he's George Crosley. And Nixon asks Chambers, have you had any dental work done since 1934 of a substantial nature? Chambers says, yes, I have. And Hiss said, could you ask him to name the dentist who performed these things? And Chambers says, Dr. Hitchcock, Westminster, Maryland. Nixon says, can you describe the condition of your teeth in 1934? And Chambers says, yes, they were in very bad shape. And Nixon says, before we leave the teeth, Mr. Hiss, do you feel that you'd have to have the dentist tell you just what he did to the teeth before you could tell anything about this man? And then Stripling chimes in and says, I certainly gathered the impression when Mr. Chambers walked in this room and you walked over and examined him and asked him to open his mouth, that you were basing your identification purely on what his upper teeth might have looked like. Now here is a person that you knew for several months at least. You knew him so well that he was a guest in your home. You gave him a Ford automobile and permitted him to use, or you leased him your apartment. And in this very important confrontation, the only thing you have to check on is this denture. Is that correct? There's nothing else about this man's features which you could definitely say, this is the man I knew as George Crosley, that you have to rely on this denture? Is that your position? And after a long silence, Hiss says, my answer to the question you've asked is this. From the time on Wednesday, August 4, 1948, when I was able to get hold of newspapers containing photographs of one Whittaker Chambers, I was struck by a certain familiarity in features. When I testified on August 5 and was shown a photograph by you, Mr. Stripling, again, there was some familiarity, features. I'm not given on important occasions to snap judgments or simple, easy statements. I'm confident that George Crosley had notably bad teeth. And then Hiss turns to Chambers and says, did you ever go under the name of George Crosley? And Chambers says, not to my knowledge. Hiss, did you ever sublet an apartment on 29th Street from me? Chambers says, no, I did not. Hiss says, you did not? Chambers says, no. Then Hiss asked him, did you ever spend any time with your wife and child in an apartment on 29th Street in Washington when I was not there because I and my family were living on P Street? And Chambers says, I most certainly did. And Hiss says, you did or did not? Chambers says, I did. And Hiss says, will you tell me how you reconcile your negative answers with this affirmative answer? And Chambers says, very easily, Alger. I was a communist and you were a communist. And Hiss says, would you be responsive and continue with your answer? And Chambers says, I do not think it's needed. And at this point, Chambers sits down and says, as I've testified to before, I came to Washington as a communist functionary, a communist of the, and he turns to Hiss and says, American Communist Party. I was connected with the American underground group of which Mr. Hiss was a member. Mr. Hiss and I became friends. To the best of my knowledge, Mr. Hiss suggested that I go there, and I gratefully accepted. I bought no furniture, I might add. And at this point, Hiss sits down and then suddenly stands up and shakes with a spasm of anger and says, Mr. Chairman, I don't need to ask Whittaker Chambers any more questions. I'm now perfectly prepared to identify this man as George Crosley. And Stripling says, you will identify him positively now? And Hiss says, I will, on the basis of what he's just said. Positively identify him without further questioning as George Crosley. And Stripling says, will you produce for the committee 3 other people who will testify that they knew him as George Crosley? And Hiss says, I will if it's possible. Why is that a question to ask me? I will see what is possible. And Nixon said, would you tell me whether during the period of time you knew him, which included a period of 3 nights or 2 or 3 nights in which you stayed overnight and 1 trip to New York, from any conversation you ever had any idea that he might be a communist? And Nixon said, I certainly didn't. And Nixon said, "You never discussed politics?" And Hiss says, "Oh, as far as I recall the conversation," and I may be confusing him with a lot of other conversations that went on in 1934 and 35. Politics was discussed quite frequently. May I just state for the record that it was not in the habit in Washington in those days, when particularly if a member of the press called on you, to ask him before you had further conversation whether or not he was a communist. It was quite a different atmosphere in Washington then than today. I had no reason to suspect George Crosley of being a communist. It never occurred to me that he might be, or whether it was any significance to me if he was. He was a press representative, and it was my job to give him information. I would like to say that to come here and discover that the ass under the lion's skin is Crosley, I don't know why your committee didn't pursue this careful method of interrogation at an earlier date before all this publicity. And Nixon says, "Well now, Mr. Hiss, you'll positively identify," and Hiss says positively, on the basis of his own statement that he was in my apartment at the time when I say he was there. I have no further questions at all. If he'd lost both his eyes and taken his nose off, I'd be sure. And at that point, Hiss, shaking a fist, walks in the direction of Chambers, who sits passively on the couch, believing that Hiss is play acting. And Hiss's voice quavers with anger, and he says, "May I say for the record at this point, I would like to invite Mr. Whittaker Chambers to make those same statements out of the presence of this committee without their being privileged for suit for libel. I challenge you to do it, and I hope you will do it damned quickly." And Stripling is afraid the two guys are going to get into a fist fight, and he lays a hand on Hiss. And Hiss says, "I'm not going to touch him. You're touching me." And Stripling says, "Please sit down, Mr. Hiss." Hiss says, "I will sit down when the chairman asks me to." And Stripling says, "I want no disturbance." And Nixon says, "Sit down, please." And then Stripling says, "I'm concerned with a statement you made before the Committee of Congress in the presence of quite a few hundred people that you didn't even know this person. You led the public and the press to believe that you didn't know such a person." And Hiss says, "I did not say that I have never seen him. I said that so far as I know, I have never seen Whittaker Chambers." And Stripling says, "Never laid eyes on him." And Hiss says, "I wouldn't have been able to identify him today for certain without his own assistance." Stripling says, "You're willing to waive the dentures?" Hiss says, "I am. Based on his own testimony, that's good enough for me." Stripling says, "You're fully aware that the public was led to believe that you'd never seen this man, heard or lays eyes upon an individual who's this individual, and now you know him." Mr. Stripling said, "Hiss, you're stating your impression of public impression." And Nixon asked him, "You never knew this man under the name of Carl?" Hiss says, "I did not." Nixon, "You never paid any money to this man for Communist Party dues?" Hiss said, "I certainly did not." Nixon said, "Did you ever discuss your hobby, ornithology, with this man?" And Hiss said, "I may very likely have. My house has pictures similar to these on the wall. This is a very appropriate hearing room. Anyone who's ever been in my house would remark that I had an interest in birds." Then Nixon said, "It would appear to me, Mr. Hiss, of all the newspaper men you were in contact with in your highly important jobs in the Nye Committee, that you must have formed some sort of affection for this man to go through all the things you did to try to occupy your home, take over your lease, give him an automobile." And Hiss asks, "May I ask how much longer this is going to go on, because I have another appointment?" And Nixon said, "The committee will rise, and you gentlemen may make yourselves comfortable. As a result of this testimony, the committee has decided to bring about a full meeting of the committee in public session Wednesday, August 25, at which time both Mr. Hiss and Mr. Chambers, whom Mr. Hiss has identified as the person he knew as Mr. Crosley, will appear as witnesses." And Hiss says, "Thank you. Am I dismissed? Is this proceeding over?" And Nixon says, "That is all. Thank you very much." And Hiss says, "I don't reciprocate." And Nixon says, "Italicize that in the record." And Hiss says, "I wish you would." And he walked out. And after a few seconds of silence, Stripling turned to Chambers and says, "Hiya, Mr. Crosley." Imagine the feelings of these two men. Hiss being summoned, he knew in his bones, to meet Chambers Crosley, and on his way down to the Commodore, Hiss had heard that another man named as a communist before Huac, Harry Dexter White, who was an assistant secretary of the Treasury and another Harvard man, had died of a heart attack. Harry Dexter White was indeed a Soviet spy, by the way. And Chambers in the bedroom, not knowing what's going to happen, suddenly hearing Hiss's voice for the first time in 15 or 10 years, Also, a couple of other little things to note. Chambers wrote in his memoirs that when he said to the committee in Hiss's presence, "I came to Washington as a functionary of the American Communist Party," I was trying to signal to Alger that I hadn't talked about espionage or any spying. I just talked about domestic political activity. I should also add, no one has ever found someone who knew Chambers or anybody else hanging around Capitol Hill as a freelance journalist named George Crosley in the mid-1930s. Chambers also said that when Stripling turned to him at the end and said, "Hiya, Mr. Crosley," it was the first sign he had that the subcommittee had taken his side. Finally, this scene was pretty devastating to Hiss. It solidified the Huac subcommittee's feeling that he was lying. A liberal historian wrote, "It's difficult to read the transcript of this encounter and not include that Alger Hiss was acting from start to finish." Prosecutor Murphy later said that when he was reading the file on the case for the first time, it was when he read this that he became convinced that Hiss was lying. And the Court of Appeals, several years later, in its decision upholding Hiss's conviction, reprinted pages of this transcript from its opinion and said, "The jury might well have believed that Hiss had been less than frank in his belated recognition of Mr. Chambers." Certainly, staging this scene was a brilliant tactical move by Nixon.